There is a town in Missouri that no longer exists. Not abandoned, not declining. Erased. The federal government paid millions of dollars to buy every single home in it, tear the town down, and bury what was left under a grass mound that visitors now walk past without knowing what is beneath their feet. That town is not the strangest story in this video. It is the last one. Between here and there, we are going to walk through 9 places across Missouri where the arithmetic of American decline is written directly into the price of a house. Places where a 3-bedroom home costs less than a used pickup truck. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time, since we map a new forgotten corner of America every week. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Let's start in the hills of southeastern Missouri, where this whole story really begins. St. Francois County sits about an hour south of St. Louis, in a stretch of oak ridges and old rail cuts known locally as the Old Lead Belt. Leadwood is one of 5 small towns that make up that district, and its name is not a marketing choice. Underground here, from 1915 to 1962, miners followed veins of galena hundreds of feet down, hauling out lead ore on more than 200 miles of underground rail line. At its peak, this district produced more than 8.5 million tons of lead, feeding ammunition factories and paint plants across the country through 2 world wars. Then, in 1962, the ore ran out. The St. Joseph Lead Company shut the Leadwood shaft, and the Underground Railroad that had once moved thousands of tons of rock a day went silent. Today, Leadwood's business district is essentially a gas station and a dollar store. Homes here have sold recently for under $100,000. With several changing hands in the $50,000 to $80,000 range, and by some recent measures, listing prices in Leadwood have actually dropped by roughly a third over the past year alone, a sign of a market with almost no buyer demand pushing back against the fall. The catch is straightforward. There is very little employment left in Leadwood itself. The nearest hospital is a drive away in Farmington, and the land underneath the entire district is still riddled with old mine shafts and mountains of crushed rock waste called chat that the Environmental Protection Agency has spent decades trying to clean up. Local residents will tell you their own grandfathers spent 30 or 40 years underground here, generation after generation, in a job that simply does not exist to hand down anymore. You can buy the house. You are also buying a piece of a landscape that mining literally hollowed out from below. Head north for about 3 hours into the rolling hills of Adair County, and you will find Novinger, a town whose entire identity is built around coal that stopped mattering to the rest of America almost 70 years ago. Novinger was platted in 1878 alongside a new railroad line, and coal turned it into a boomtown almost overnight, drawing Welsh, German, Italian, and Balkan immigrant families to work more than 50 mines that opened across the county. By 1901, Novinger had grown enough to incorporate as a city, with a population in the thousands. Then came the slow squeeze that hit coal towns everywhere in the 20th century. The Great Depression thinned the workforce. And after World War II, American homes converted to natural gas and electric heat, cutting demand for the coal Novinger produced. The Billy Creek Mine, the last operating deep shaft coal mine in the entire state of Missouri, closed in January of 1966. The railroads had already pulled out by 1950. As if that weren't enough, Novinger has spent the last 2 decades getting hit by disasters that had nothing to do with the economy. Flash floods in 2008 and 2009 that swamped the low-lying parts of town. A tornado in 2009 that damaged homes on the town's southern edge, and a fire in 2010 that destroyed 5 buildings in what remained of the business district, including the old city hall. The population, once in the thousands, now sits at roughly 380 people. What's left is a coal miners' museum, a replica log homestead built to show what an early miner's cabin looked like, a couple of car repair shops, a convenience store, a gift shop, and a town that still marks its calendar by an annual Coal Miner Days celebration, which the tornado and flood damage forced organizers to cancel the very year both disasters struck. The catch here isn't contamination, it's isolation, stacked on top of repeated disaster. This is a floodplain town roughly 2.5 hours from the nearest larger city, with a local economy that peaked before most of its current residents were even born, and with very little chance of a new industry choosing to build here instead of somewhere closer to a highway. Now drop south, almost to the Arkansas border, into the flat cotton country of the Missouri Bootheel. Kennett is the seat of Dunklin County, and by most rankings it is the single cheapest place to buy a home anywhere in the state of Missouri, with a median home price hovering under $120,000 and some individual homes in the surrounding county selling in the $25,000 to $40,000 range. The story here isn't a mine that closed. It's a crop that stopped needing people. Dunklin County has been one of Missouri's top producers of cotton, watermelon, and cantaloupe for more than a century. And cotton built this corner of the state plantation by plantation through the early 20th century. But mechanical cotton pickers, which spread through the Bootheel in the 1940s and 50s, did to farm labor here what coal mechanization did to Appalachia. They made thousands of jobs unnecessary almost overnight. Families who had worked these fields for generations left for cities like St. Louis, Memphis, and Chicago in a wave historians now count as part of the Great Migration, the same demographic shift that hollowed out sharecropping communities across the entire Mississippi Delta region, of which the Missouri Bootheel is technically the northernmost edge. Dunklin County's population has kept shrinking ever since, falling more than 11% between 2010 and 2020 alone, faster than almost any other county in the state. Part of a broader pattern across the 6 counties of the Bootheel, not one of which grew at all between 2020 and 2024, even as the rest of Missouri's rural south, closer to the Ozark Lakes, was gaining residents over that same stretch. What remains in Kennett today is a small manufacturing and healthcare base built around employers like a filtration equipment maker and a medical supply company, a renovated downtown theater that still screens family films, and a property crime rate well above the national average. A pattern that tends to follow concentrated poverty in agricultural regions that lost their labor economy decades ago. Local employment across the town's job base actually shrank again just last year. The land itself is still some of the richest farmland in the Midwest. It simply doesn't need very many people to work it anymore. And the people it no longer needs are the ones filling out these listings. Let's go back up into St. Francois County, because Leadwood's story only makes sense once you understand where it started, in the town of Bonne Terre. This is where in 1864 the St. Joseph Lead Company bought nearly 1,000 acres of ground and built what became the largest, most profitable lead mine on Earth, running continuously until 1961. Unlike its smaller neighbors, Bonne Terre did not fully hollow out. Its homes today list in a broader range, commonly between $150,000 and $200,000, noticeably higher than Leadwood or Desloge just down the road. Here is the twist. The mine itself is the reason why. When the pumps were switched off in the early 1960s, groundwater flooded the lowest 3 levels of the mine, creating what is now billed as the largest man-made cavern and the largest freshwater diving resort in the world. Jacques Cousteau's own dive crew filmed here in 1983. Today, the Bonne Terre mine draws roughly 15,000 scuba divers and twice that many tourists every year. Walking and boating through 5 levels of hand-cut tunnels 200 feet below the town's quiet streets, past submerged ore carts and wooden catwalks that miners simply left behind when the pumps switched off, because it was cheaper to abandon the equipment than to haul it back to the surface. Bonne Terre found something almost none of these towns managed to find: a second act. But it is worth sitting with the irony. The very collapse that emptied out its sister towns became, here, a tourist attraction, while the ground a few miles away just sits abandoned, chat pile and all. From the Lead Belt, drive 2 hours northwest into Macon County, and you'll reach Bevier, a town that once called itself the coal capital of Missouri. Coal was discovered here in 1860, and within a few decades, Bevier had grown into a genuine boomtown of roughly 2,000 residents, with hotels, churches, and a business district serving a county that, at its peak, hosted more than 350 active commercial mines. Welsh and Italian immigrants poured in to work shafts with names like the Bevier Black Diamond Mine. And for a stretch of the late 19th century, this small patch of north-central Missouri was one of the most productive coal regions in the state. The decline mirrors Novinger's almost exactly. As coal use faded through the 20th century, the mines closed one by one, and the town's population began a slide that has never reversed. Today, Bevier is home to roughly 630 people, less than a third of its historic peak, with a median household income around $47,000 and a poverty rate above 15%. And the population is still edging downward every year. Homes inside the town itself have recently listed for as little as $65,000. A local museum called the Black Diamond Museum, a preserved mine room at the County Historical Society, and a set of original labor documents signed by the United Mine Workers of America back in 1933 are about the only visible reminders that this was once a company town built entirely on coal seams that are now empty rock, worked out and left behind decades before most of the state stopped noticing Bevier existed at all. If you've made it this far, I appreciate you sticking around, because the next few towns are where this story gets genuinely strange, so if you want to see the rest of them, subscribing costs nothing and it helps more than you'd think. Back down in the Booteal along the Mississippi River itself sits Caruthersville, the seat of Pemiscot County. This is a river town in the fullest sense, built on a bluff after its predecessor, the original county seat of Gayoso, was slowly eaten away by the shifting Mississippi and disappeared entirely around the year 1900. A warning about the river that residents here have never fully been able to forget. Pemiscot County's population has fallen for decades, driven by the same agricultural mechanization that hollowed out Kennett. And today, Caruthersville's homes sell across an unusually wide range, with some going for as little as $20,000 to $25,000 and others, mostly larger or newer properties, reaching well over $100,000. The town has tried to reinvent itself around a riverboat-style casino and hotel on the water, which recently expanded and now anchors what's left of the local economy alongside agribusiness and a handful of retail employers strung along the interstate. Local real estate agents describe an older housing stock full of historic colonial revival 2-story homes, the kind of architecture that once signaled real prosperity here, now sitting on the market at a fraction of what similar houses would fetch almost anywhere else in the country. But the catch is written into the landscape itself. This stretch of the Mississippi still floods, held back only by a levee system built after repeated disasters. The county carries one of the higher poverty rates in the state at over 30%, and the nearest major hospital systems sit well outside the county line. Caruthersville is proof that river access, which built so much of American wealth in the 19th century, can just as easily be the reason a town stays cheap in the 21st. Now let's return to the old lead belt one more time, because there's a piece of this story we haven't told yet. In 1994, 3 adjacent dying mining towns, Flat River, Elvins, and Esther, made a decision that says everything about how far things had fallen. They merged into a single city, Park Hills, essentially pooling what little tax base they had left just to keep basic services running. The mines here closed in 1972, the last operation to shut down anywhere in the old lead belt. And what they left behind wasn't just empty shafts, it was chat. Mountains of crushed waste rock, some piled hundreds of feet high, sitting directly beside residential streets for decades before the Environmental Protection Agency began remediating them. One entire street in Park Hills still borders what used to be the Deslogues chat pile, now partially converted into an industrial park after years of remediation work that residents watched unfold slowly, one block at a time for the better part of a decade. In a strange twist, the flooded mine tunnels beneath the town, the same kind that turned Bonne Terre into a diving resort, now supply Park Hills and its neighbors with drinking water, drawn up from roughly 300 feet below ground through a system originally dug for an entirely different purpose. More than 1,000 miles of abandoned mine tunnels and 300 miles of underground railway still lie beneath this stretch of St. Francois County, a hollow layer under the modern town that most residents never think about, and that shows up on no map new homeowners are ever handed. Homes in Park Hills today commonly list in the range of $150,000, cheaper than the state average, but higher than tiny Leadwood next door, reflecting a town that consolidated just enough to survive, even as the mining jobs that built it never came back. From Park Hills, it's a short drive northeast to Herculaneum, a town named with unintentional irony after the Roman city buried by a volcano. Herculaneum built its own identity around a lead smelter, not a mine, that opened in 1892 and ran continuously for 121 years, making it the last operating primary lead smelter in the entire United States by the time it finally closed in 2013. For over a century, that smelter meant steady paychecks, generation after generation, in a town small enough that almost everyone either worked the plant directly or knew someone who did. It also meant something else. Lead dust and emissions settled into the soil of the neighborhoods closest to the plant for generations, and testing eventually found blood lead levels in local children that were multiple times higher than what health officials consider safe. The response was almost unheard of. The smelter's owner, under regulatory pressure, agreed to buy out and demolish roughly 160 homes in the historic downtown blocks closest to the plant, essentially erasing part of the town's own center years before the smelter itself ever shut its gates. Families who had lived within sight of the smokestacks for generations took buyout checks and relocated to newer subdivisions on the far side of town, leaving empty lots where a walkable main street used to stand. What remains of Herculaneum today is a smaller, quieter river community, still working through soil remediation across residential yards long after the smelter closed for good, with home prices that reflect both its proximity to the St. Louis metro and the lingering caution buyers bring to a town whose name is still, fairly or not, associated with lead contamination. It is one of the few places on this list where the danger wasn't that the industry left. It was that the industry stayed for 121 years. And that brings us back to where we started. The town that no longer exists is called Times Beach, and it sat about 20 miles southwest of St. Louis, along the Merrimack River. In the early 1970s, the city hired a waste oil hauler to spray its dusty, unpaved roads to keep dust down, a common and cheap practice at the time. The oil he used was contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds ever studied, a byproduct tied to the production of Agent Orange. For nearly a decade, nobody in Times Beach knew. Horses started dying at local stables. Birds dropped from the sky. In December of 1982, the Merrimack River flooded catastrophically, spreading contaminated soil across the entire town just as federal investigators were finishing their testing. Residents who had been evacuated for the flood were told, days later, not to bother going home. The Centers for Disease Control informed the roughly 2,200 residents of Times Beach that their town was now too dangerous to live in at all. President Reagan formed a federal task force to study the danger, and in February of 1983, the Environmental Protection Agency announced a buyout using Superfund dollars, ultimately purchasing every one of the town's roughly 800 homes and 30 businesses at a cost that reached into the tens of millions of dollars. It was the first time in American history the federal government had evacuated and purchased an entire town because of chemical contamination, and it became one of the founding test cases for the Superfund program itself. Nearly every structure was eventually torn down. One elderly couple reportedly refused to leave for as long as they could. Contaminated soil from Times Beach and more than 24 other dioxin sites across eastern Missouri was excavated and incinerated on the spot between 1996 and 1997, at a total cleanup cost north of $100 million. The ashes and remediated earth were mounded and covered with grass. Today, the site is Route 66 State Park, and if you didn't know its history, you could walk across the exact spot where Times Beach's main street used to run and never notice a thing. You cannot buy a cheap house in Times Beach, because there is no house left to buy, and no lot for sale, and no street address that still exists. It is the most extreme version of everything this video has been about. A town that got so hollowed out, in this case by poison rather than economics, that it simply stopped existing at all. So, why does this keep happening across Missouri over and over in different decades and different industries? The pattern underneath all 9 of these towns is almost identical. A single resource or crop pulled thousands of people into a small patch of land, whether that resource was lead, coal, or cotton. Company towns went up fast, built to house a workforce rather than to last for generations, and for a stretch of 20 or 30 years, that arrangement genuinely worked. Wages were steady. Churches, schools, and downtown storefronts followed the paychecks. Then the resource ran out, or got mechanized, or got regulated, or the world simply stopped needing what that particular hillside or riverbank produced, and there was nothing built underneath any of it to catch the fall. No second industry waiting in reserve. No large employers standing by to absorb the workforce. Just houses, built quickly for people who are not coming back. Priced today according to a demand curve that has been pointing in one direction since sometime around the middle of the 20th century. Who can actually live in a place like this? Honestly, a smaller group than the price tag alone might suggest. Retirees on fixed incomes who value low costs over convenience and proximity. People who can work entirely remotely and genuinely do not need to commute anywhere. Buyers willing to do real homework first on old mine maps, flood zones, soil testing, and school enrollment numbers before they ever sign anything. What these towns are not is a shortcut to easy real estate wealth. The price is cheap because the story is heavy. And every single number in this video makes sense once you understand exactly what that town actually lived through to get here. None of these places are asking to be pitied. They are simply asking, quietly, to be understood before anyone shows up with a checkbook. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Out of everywhere we visited tonight, from the flooded lead mine to the town that got quietly erased from the map, which one would you actually consider living in? And which one would you never go near no matter how low the price dropped? Tell me in the comments below and be specific about which town and why, because I genuinely read all of them. If this kind of forgotten American geography interests you. We're doing it again next week, somewhere that will make even Missouri's emptiest corners look crowded by comparison. This video is for informational and historical purposes only, and is not financial or investment advice. Property values change, and viewers should do their own research or consult a professional before making any purchase decisions.